Hello and welcome to C++11 Beginner Tutorials by Gamer2Creator. I'm Chris. So real quick, I wanted to point out that there's a little typo in this from last lesson. This should have been first to make it clear that this is the first name and this is the last name, and same down here. So it's time to finally talk about functions. Well, we've been using a function this entire time. Int main, followed by the parentheses, followed by the function body, which is between the next two curly brackets. This is the definition of a function. It has the return type, the name of the function, the parameter list, and then the body. Now if you have anything here other than void, because void means nothing, you need a return statement that returns the same type. Here in int main we have an int, so main returns an integer. Here we return an integer at the end of main, so it's correct. Now, like I said, if this was void, then void means nothing. It's null, it's void. Not really null, but the idea of void, it's empty. It doesn't have a type, so it doesn't really return anything. So you don't need a return statement. You can put one in there, but it doesn't return an object, such as 0. It would just return. That means return from the statement. End it right now. Right here on this line, end it. So I'm not sure it's proper to have a void main, because usually you'd want the int. We're just going to do int main. We're going to leave it like this. We're going to remove this code. And we're going to remove all but the employee. Well, actually, let's leave this. We might need this. We're going to write our own function. And what it's going to do, it's going to ask the user to create an employee. And it's going to return the employee. So first we need a return type. Well, it's going to be an employee. Then we give it a name. In this case, the goal of this function is to get the employee from the console so that the user can input it. So we're going to call it get employee from console. Kind of a long name, but it's very descriptive. And then you put the parameter list, which we don't need any right now, so it's empty. There are no parameters, which is the same as void. It's more of a C thing. You don't have to put anything in there. So we have our function. In between these two brackets is the code for our function. Now you can think of functions as your instructions. They're your verb. Classes are your data. Your numbers, your ints, your strings, your floats, your characters. And functions are the work that needs to be done, your verbs. So we're going to put our commands in here, and we're going to output to the console getting an employee, so the user of this application knows what's going on. We're going to end this line. Enter first name. That's the first thing we're going to get, is the employee's first name. But we don't have an employee yet. We never created one, so we have nowhere to put the first name. So we'll create one. We'll create our variable employee. We're going to call it emp for short, so we don't have to do much typing. And we can name this just E if we wanted to, or whatever, but I think emp is good enough. So we need to use sin to get the first name. Sin and then we're going to say, well, where do we want to put this string that we're getting from the console? Well, we want to put it in imps dot m first name, or name first. Excuse me. So that should get that done. Now we need a sin dot ignore to get rid of the new line from when the user pushed enter. Again, that is something you don't quite have to understand yet until we go over streams in detail. But we're going to want to do this again for the last name. And we can do this for actually every data type. But we need to actually put in here, like we have enter the first name, and that's great. And we need to put enter the second name, or last name we'll call it. And then we're going to ask for the rest of this data. Count, enter, and I think it's kind of retarded to have a wait here now that we've changed it to employee. So we're just going to remove the wait. That's no longer a part of the class. We don't care. Enter age. And then send imp dot in age. And we need the send dot ignore. Now we're going to count again for the last one, that is enter salary. Okay, so this code might look a little confusing. It might not. What we've done here, we've done this before, something very similar to this. But we're now using functions and classes to get this done. First, we're going to have to call this function from main. So if we want in main to access this function and do the work inside of it, then we need to call it. Now the only function you'll ever not actually have to call yourself is main. The operating system does that for you and begins your program. So now that we're in main, we know that the operating system has began our program, and we want to get an employee, and we'll call it new employee, and then we're gonna leave it empty. And then on a new line here, we're going to say new employee equals get employee from console. Now this works. Almost. We haven't finished our function yet, but the idea of what we've just done here is we're calling this function that we defined up here. We defined it up here. We didn't tell the computer to do it yet until we actually call it. So what is our function going to do? First, it makes an employee, and then it uses the console to get its data, and then it returns an employee, but we haven't returned anything yet, and that's what we need to do to finish this function. We can actually return the employee itself, the entire object, by using return and then the variable that we want to return. That would be emp, which is of type employee, which is the same type that we declared as the return type. So this is valid code. What's going to happen once we call it is the runtime will call this function and then replace the function call with the employee that it actually returns. Like this. I mean, this isn't exactly how it works, but this is how you can think about it working. Is that it's actually returning this object from this function call, and then it's assigning it here, because that's what we wanted to do with the function call. Now what it's going to do, it's actually going to copy this employee. But since it's okay in our position here and to copy this information, we're good. It's okay. In some cases you may not want a copy operation. You'd have to do things a little bit differently. But for this situation, it's just fine. And we'll get into that later. So this is the basic idea behind functions. And this is why I wanted to point out object-oriented programming before I did functions, is because that way we could return an entire object. Now, you couldn't do this without an employee, because if you can only return one type from a function and you wanted to just do a built-in type, well, you could return an int, but that's not an employee. An integer isn't enough information to be an employee. And neither is just a string. However, like if you wanted to get int from console, it can be useful to just do an int, but you are limited to the idea of just an integer. So for instance here, we wrote a function that can get an integer from the console. So it does all this work for us, and it only uses an integer. So we can actually use this function throughout our code. Let's say we're going to remove this, that we wanted to, I don't know, let's say that we wanted to get the player's guess, like from our old homework. And we can say int player guess. And then we can say we're going to count what we're doing here. Enter guess. And this is just a little example. And then we can say equals get int from console. And what it's going to do, it's going to call this function. So it's going to jump from right here to right here. And it's going to execute this line. It's going to create an int. It's going to fill it from the input, from the console input. It's going to remove that pesky new line. And then it's going to return my input. And remember, it will copy my input. And then this will actually be an integer. So let's get this in the debugger, and I'll show you exactly what's going on. And I'm going to minimize that so it's not in our way. And we're just going to simply get an integer from the console. First, actually, let's make sure this works. We're going to count you entered player guess in line. So let's make sure that it returns whatever we typed in. You entered, and then it has our number. So in the debugger, we're going to click play. Now here we are. As you can see with the little yellow arrow, this is the line that is waiting to be executed. And we can step over the line, or we can step into. And what over and into is talking about are the function calls. So we want to step into our function, which is going to be this one. Hopefully. Alright, well, it's going to go into the stream thing first. So we need to step over first. Step out. We'll step over. Now we're where we want to be. We're right here on this line. It hasn't executed this line yet, but it's going to. So we hit step into. Now, you see where the little arrow jumped to? The very beginning of the function that we just called. It's going to jump to right here. And then as we step over, it created our int, and it didn't assign it anything. That's just a junk value because we didn't tell it to. And then it's going to ask for input, and then I'll just type in some number. Then it does send.ignore. Now we're at this statement. As you can see, my input equals 4343. Now when I step over, it's at the end, and boom, it jumped right from the return statement of this function back to where we were right before we called the function on this line. And you can see here in the debugger, I'll scoot this over, that getInt from console returned 4343, which is of a type integer. So this function call returned 4343. So it's as if this text here, you can imagine this in your head, that it is now replaced with 4343. And then it's assigned to our new integer here, player guess, which until this line finished executing is still filled with a junk value. Boom, there you go, 4343. So that's a very basic function call. And then we're on this line, and it's going to print it out, yada yada yada. And that's functions. They're just a very basic idea that you stick commands in them and you can reuse them. We can call this function as often as we want, anywhere that we want, as long as it's defined before we call it. And what this, some of the benefits of this is that now that we've written this function and it works and it seems to be bug free, every time we use it, we know it'll work because it's the same code being reused. So it's a system that allows you to only write things once if you put them in their own function. So you have to think about, like in your objects where you added certain data to create an object, you want to divide your functions up to get little problems solved. And then all of your functions together can solve bigger problems. That's how Facebook is built, or whatever. It's a whole lot of smaller problems being solved within functions that together solve bigger problems. And you only have to write it once thanks to functions. And then anytime you need to debug, like you think there's a bug in this, you can just set the debugger, boom, right here. So now that we have a breakpoint, because we clicked here and there's a little red circle, and we're going to stop running our last instance, boom, it stops right here in this function, and we can step through and watch the variables here in the locals. That's what locals means. They're local to this function. So we know that right now input is a junk value. We can watch what happens to these as the program executes. And so input now equals what I just input, so that's good. So we know that it's working. Now to show you one of the important uses of this. So here we return just an integer. Here we can return an entire employee and all of its data together as one object. But now we can reuse this function up here, the getInt from console. For example, age is an integer. We defined int mAge for each employee. And now we have a function that can get an integer from a console. So instead of doing this send push right and a send.ignore, we can, oops, oh, this is the wrong line, excuse me. We'll do it here on age. We can take away this bug-prone code and use our function instead, getInt from console. And as you see, it will do the code in our function here every time we call it. And since we know that code works, we can actually replace a lot of the dirty, messy code with just a function call. And this is how you start building a code base, where you make your functions that do stuff, and you use them within your program. And together they can solve whatever problem domain you're working on. And to prove to you this works, and show you the way this will execute, because this is getting pretty interesting. We're getting into some rather complicated stuff, and this will take time to sink in. You need a lot of practice, keep writing code, and choose projects to do that are just beyond your current skill set, that will require you to learn a little bit but still within reach. Pick something that you don't know and make sure that's a part of your project. And then you just keep demystifying things one at a time, and it's a process. So what we're going to do is we're going to want to make an employee. Now we're going to pretend like we're adding this, like this is some program that some employer is making to add employees to some kind of database. And we're going to call this new employee, and then we're going to do get an employee from console. So this allows the employer to enter information about his new employee. And you can imagine this actually happening in the workplace, that someone hires someone and now they need to add them to the computer database. And then we do this, and then we can print it back out. And we're going to pretend like instead of printing it, we're putting it into a database or something. But instead, just for the purposes of this tutorial, we're going to print it back out. Let's see. And then the last one is salary. So, the idea behind this code is again pretty simple. We're going to create an employee. It's going to be the data that holds the information regarding our new employee. So we're creating a new employee, we're getting it from the console, and then we're printing it back out. In a real application, they would probably put this into a database, save it to a file, do something like that, but we're not quite there yet. So we're going to step through this, and we're going to see exactly what happens once we call this. Because remember that we call this, which then goes to the top of this function that we called. But inside this function, we've actually called another function. And then another down here. And I'm going to delete a little bit of white space. Not that it matters, but it's prettier. So we're going to stop this. And we're going to stop right here. And this is only the second line in our application, because remember, main is where the function is the function that's called first by the operating system. So we're right here. This line has not been executed quite yet. We're going to step into, and as we can see, nothing has been outputted. We're going to step into this line. Whoop, and we jumped way up here to this function that we created earlier. All the way from here to here. So we're going to step over, and as usual we go through line by line, and you can see that it's printing out what we told it to. And now that we've gotten right here, we're going to have to start putting in some information, because it wants our first name. So we'll just do me again, Chris, and we step over and over again and over again, and now it wants the last name, and we'll do Lee. Alright, so far so good. Enter age. Now here's the interesting part. We started out in main and we called this function, but now we're here and we're about to call yet another function. And this is going to be hard to understand at first, but this is the way programming works, where you can call functions within functions many times over, and you will. Function calls will get very deep. But this function that we're in currently will not return yet until we get to here. But when we call this function, watch what happens. Step over. Whoop, and then we jump all the way up here. So we're not even in this function anymore. We're in this function. But if you look down here in this stack, you can see that right here is that function that we were in and then jumped out of to get to here. And then you can even see main is here. This is your stack. Every time you call a function, it adds it to the stack. And this is kind of small. I don't know if you can read this. Let me make this bigger. I can't make the text any bigger. But it says main and then get employee from console and then get in from console. Now that means that technically all three of these functions have not returned yet. They're still live, but they're waiting for the last one to return that was called. The last one that was called must return unless you push another one onto the stack. So let's go back to where we are right now. So we just called get in from console. Now it's going to do its work, and we've seen this already before. It's going to go down line by line, yada yada yada, enter age, 34, no, I'm not doing 34, I'm 27. And then it's important to know, now that we've hit the return function, remember we're in the last function on the stack. So what happens when we return? Watch the stack. Boom. We go right back to where we were before we called this function. This is where we called this function. And this function that we called is no longer on the stack. It's been removed. And then we continue down this function, and here we call get in from console yet again. And then we jump up here and we go through it line by line, yada yada yada. Just gonna enter a number. Then we step over, and here we can see get in from console. It's the last one on the top of the stack. And when it returns, it's removed. And the value that it returned is replaced right here. And now we're reaching the end of get employee from console. And now this function will do the exact same thing. When it returns, it gets removed from the stack. And now we're all the way back in main, our very first function that we didn't have to call ourselves. And then it goes through and it's going to print what I just entered if everything went correct. Let's see. I entered the first name Chris, and it prints Chris, last name Lee, 27 and $20,000. So as you can see, it works. Now this is by far the most complex application that we have designed so far. And this is going to require some time for it to sink in. It took a long time for me. And I've taught some people recently, and it's the same. It takes a while for your mind to change the way it thinks to this very logical, one command after another Boolean logic type of thinking. But it'll happen, and then it just becomes second nature. So don't get down on yourself if this is hard at first. And I want to point out that so far you've only seen two functions, and they both got stuff from the console. That just happens to be because we're making a console application, and that's what I came up with. But your imagination is the limit to what you can do within a function and what you want it to do. It's up to you entirely. I mean, you could make a function that takes in a string and then prints it out backwards, or you know, just anything you want. An entire every application that you've ever seen, whether it be in a game or I don't know, word processor, it's all built with functions. And most of them are very small, to the point applications, functions that just do something very small, a very small amount of work. But there's a lot of them, and together they work together to solve the problem of whatever application you're working on. And I hope that this didn't confuse you too much. Stick with it. Because there's not a whole lot more new syntax. Everything is built out of functions and variables. So you're getting very far into what you can do, knowing what you know so far. You've made a lot of progress if you've gotten this far.